Welcome everyone to WCAG 2.1 Deep Dive, and thank you all for being here today. What I'd like to do is welcome today's speaker, Jonathan Whiting. Jonathan is the Director of Training at WebAIM. His main passion is helping others learn to make the web more accessible to people with disabilities. With a master's degree in instructional technology and almost 20 years of experience in the field of web accessibility. Jonathan has published dozens of articles, tutorials, and other instructional resources. He has traveled extensively to train thousands of web developers and other professionals to develop and maintain web content. Jerry Smith, unfortunately, could not make it today. He had COVID. Now, when Jonathan will speak, and he'll take care of everything very well, there are some things we encourage you to think. We encourage you to think of how well the new 2.1 criteria impact our end user. We want you to think about how will it impact what you do. And we also want you to think about what do you need in order to be ready to add 2.1 criteria to the state accessibility standard. We will send you a link to a survey immediately following this event. If you answer the survey after the previous event, please still answer this one. We got a question in there that will allow you to either renew or change your answer from the last survey if you want to. Okay? So thank you very much for answering the survey. We got great responses in the last survey. So I've introduced the speakers, and now I'm gonna have at it. So Jonathan, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Gonna get my screen share going here. Sorry, give me one sec. All right, I'm assuming you can see those slides. Unless somebody chimes in and says otherwise, I think we're going to be good to go. So yeah, thank you so much, Jay, for that intro and for the opportunity to talk again. Hopefully, those of you who are in attendance were able to attend our earlier session talking about some things that were new in WCAG 2.1. It was a little more general in its scope. For those who, sorry, I just want to double check. Thank you. So for those who are content creators, others is more broad. We talked a little bit about legal requirements and provided a brief overview of WCAG 2.1. We're going to take a little deeper dive into WCAG 2.1 today. First thing I wanted to mention before we get too far in is that we do have slides that are available. This is where it's going to be a little tricky. It's always a little harder for me to post things to chat in Teams as I'm presenting. Give me just 1 second to try to do that. And we'll put a link to these slides into chat. Okay. There we go. So this is where you can find both the slide decks for these two sessions as well as some resources. So you're welcome to go to that page. I'm going to actually just kind of pull up that page real quick in my browser. So we do have, again, links to both slide decks for our earlier session and the one today, session 2, and then some links to some evaluation tools, some of which we talked about last time, some of which we'll talk about this time, and then a couple others that just really like using. And some resources that are related to some of the things we've talked about, and then again, maybe some other resources that you might find useful. So you are welcome to reference that, not just today, but into the future. So with that, I'm going to give just a little outline. This outline, I'm going to actually be a little more technical. Again, this is that deeper dive. I'm going to talk a little bit about what requirements, what success criteria we're going to cover today. And we will talk about all of these, but just to give you a little overview. And again, if some of these terms are a little strange, that's par for the course. That's pretty normal for WCAG. But we're going to talk a little bit about non-text contrast. Now, we did talk about non-text contrast last time as it related to graphics primarily. We're going to talk a little bit today about user interface components, things that you interact with. We'll talk about text spacing a little bit more. Again, when we talked about earlier, we want to talk just a bit more about how to test that and why that may occur. And then we'll talk about some additional requirements related to content on hover and focus. There's one called Identify Input Purpose that will explain in more detail later on. Character key shortcuts has to do with single key shortcuts and some accessibility issues with those. And a little bit on status messages, things that pop up, like toast or temporary messages that pop up on screen. And then the final bit that we'll talk about will be related to mobile accessibility, some requirements related to how a user might orient their orientation, how they might orient their device horizontally or vertically. Pointer gestures related to some, avoiding requiring of gesture-based activities. And we'll talk about that in more detail as well. Pointer cancellation, the idea of making sure that things occur when the user lifts their finger or lifts their mouse cursor or that kind of thing. And pointer actuation and target size. We'll talk about all of those in more detail later on as well. So that's just a little overview. We'll spend approximately an hour talking about these topics. That might be, time will vary a little bit based on questions. And then we're going to try to leave a block of time at the end to talk about maybe some other questions that you might have. I will do my best to explain these things, hopefully at a level that they're useful for everyone, even if you don't consider yourself a developer. But I'm also comfortable if people choose to ask more technical questions, we'll do our best to answer those as well. So hopefully this is going to be relevant for not just developers, but we can get a little more technical this time. All right, speaking of getting a little bit more technical, one thing I do want to do is dive a little bit more into the structure of WCAG. We talked about this a little bit last time. We talked about and this is, I just put a link into chat to a version of WCAG called the quick reference, where basically parts of WCAG are collapsed or you've got little accordions or little disclosure kinds of areas where things are just hidden from view until you choose to interact with them. Just a little refresher. The way WCAG is structured, there are 4 principles of accessibility. Perceivable, can you, with the senses available to you, get that content? Operable, can you interact with or navigate within content? Understandable and robust, does content work with the technologies and the techniques that you're using? And so within each principle, you have guidelines. A guideline, for example, the first is on text alternatives. The second is on time-based media or multimedia. Within each guideline, we have success criteria that each have a level. So 1.2.1, for example, is within the principle of perceivable, the guideline related to media. And this first requirement, 1.2.1, deals with audio and video only media and is level single A. For many of these success criteria with lengthier descriptions, there's an abbreviated part of the requirement that's visible. You can select show or hide full description to see more or hide more of that information. So that's how WCAG is structured, right? The principles, guidelines, success criteria, and each success criterion has a level. Wanted to mention a couple other resources related to WCAG that can be useful. One is, and I want to mention these are in addition to WCAG, the guidelines. So again, we're focusing on 2.1 and what's new in version 2.1 of these guidelines. But the guidelines themselves, that's pretty much what it is. The principles, guidelines, success criteria, and some definitions and a few things like that at the end. In addition to that, there are what are called advisory or non-normative kind of additional information for each of these requirements to give you a little more info on what you need to do to meet one of these. So if you come to a requirement and you think, well, I kind of know what this means, but I'd like some examples. There's a section that you can expand under each of the success criteria, show techniques and failures for whatever number that is. These techniques, there are 3 different types of techniques you may see. Now, they're not all available for each requirement, but there are 3 possibilities. One is, the first is sufficient techniques. So those are things, well, if you're doing this thing, then chances are good you're meeting this requirement. Second are advisory techniques. This is maybe a little bit of additional information, maybe beyond what's required, but something that you could consider. And then next are failures. If you're doing this thing, you're probably almost certainly failing this requirement. And so those are available for success criteria, different, most don't have quite as many as this first example I'm showing, but those are available. If you follow those links, they'll take you to these supporting resources on these different techniques. Also available for each of the requirements is a link that says understanding and then the number of that success criterion. If I go to one of those pages, there's this great, very detailed usually resource on what does this mean? Why is it there? What's the intent? What are the benefits? Why? Who does this impact? What are some examples? Are there some resources, some related resources that can help me understand this more? And then it also gives you links to those techniques I just showed as well. Now, there are well over 1,000 pages of these supporting materials. There's a lot there. I mentioned last time a checklist, and it's available as a link in that resource page. A checklist from WebAIM that has kind of tried to condense this down. But if you ever want to dig a little deeper, understand any of these requirements in more detail, this is going to be, you probably want to go to the source. So this is one place where you can find that, maybe condensed a little bit, make it easier to find what you're looking for. I did just want to point out that one resource related to WCAG before moving on and talking about some of these specific requirements. I want to check, just kind of pause and see if anybody has any questions before we continue. Any questions about WCAG or the structure? Oh, there was a question. If we didn't attend the first meeting, can we view it online? That is available. Jay can help you get access to that first meeting. So yeah, that is. Jeff, you wanted to mention that?
This is Jay. Thank you for bringing that up. I should have mentioned that earlier. Yes, if you go to the STRNS site where you found your link to this event, we now have a recording for the first event on there available. And if you are not a member of the Secretary brand, you could check with your digital accessibility coordinator and they will have that link to share with you. We do not yet have a transcript of the event. We'll be posting that transcript as soon as we get it. So you both have a recording and a transcript. We'll do the same thing with this event. So we can get this event captioned and put recording there. I'll try that along with the transcript as well. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. Thanks, Jay. Okay, anything else before we continue? All right, not seeing anything in chat, I'm going to. And because I do think we might have a few new people, I do want to just maybe briefly mention that we really are focusing just on things that are new. Well, I say new, that are part of WCAG 2.1, which became an official recommendation in 2018. Just that is going to be kind of the scope here. We did talk last time about contrast of graphical objects. That was something we went into some detail on. I want to just briefly maybe refresh people's memory a bit on that requirement. We've got on the screen right now, this is a screenshot of some icons. There's a little downward pointing arrow, something that looks like a garbage can. I don't know, some kind of, it looks like maybe there's some lines of text in this icon. So no text, just icons that represent some information. So these are graphical objects that convey information, and you would need to have 3:1 contrast of these objects with their background so that you can distinguish those, right? Now, it does say that this is only when the icons are required to understand the content. So if I had a graphical object like, say, that trash can icon before, but now next to it, I actually have the word trash, well, then the icon itself really just reinforces the text, the word synced, that image reinforces the word synced. And so there wouldn't be contrast requirements for those. That sort of abstract, that image that has some lines, it turns out that will take you to the feed part of this. And again, the word feed, that icon just reinforces feed. Now, something kind of interesting with this example though, what about the red circle that's part of that icon? So in the upper left corner of this feed icon, there's a red circle. And if with experience in this page, I know what that means. I know that means that I have some unread items in my feed. Well, that is something that's graphical that is required to understand this content that is only available in that image and would need that 3:1 contrast. Remember last time we did talk about some tools to help you test that contrast. One was a contrast checker from WebAIM. So I'm going to bring this over and sort of just do a little, I'm going to log kind of I'm going to sort of dock this contrast checker on the side of my screen. In just a second, I will throw a link to this. It is in that resource page, but I can put a link to chat in just a second for this resource. But I could use the eyedropper tools that are available in this. If I go to foreground color, for example, and I click, and this is again in this contrast checker, there's a foreground color block, where if I click on it, there's an eyedropper tool. I could use this eyedropper tool and click on that red. And then maybe just double check. I'm not sure that's a white background, so I might check the background color. Do the same thing with the background color block, check the color right next to the red. It's not quite white, it's close, but not quite. And if I look and see in this image, that red circle has under 3:1 contrast with its background. It's got 2.78, so just under 3:1 contrast. So this would be a failure of this requirement. Again, the main reason for this is for those who have, say, maybe don't have as much contrast sensitivity. That happens to almost all of us with age. I'm starting to experience it myself, just not quite able to see, distinguish as much contrast as I once could. So, you know, if you really had reduced sensitivity, would you identify that that image is telling you there are unread items in your feed? So that's kind of the idea with that requirement. And I mentioned earlier that beyond just graphics, it also does talk. I actually wanted to make one other point with these graphical objects, and that is we talked about this requirement is for not just always one color requirement. It's not just always foreground and background. The term that's used in 2.1 is against adjacent colors. So what does that mean? That means any colors that touch where you need to be able to distinguish those different colors to understand that image. So if I look back at the example of the feed icon, that circle's kind of offset from the gray feed. So on its own, you really just need to have contrast with the background for that red circle. What about this image on screen now? It's an exclamation mark with a triangle, and both of those are part of this icon. Now I'm going to assume that this icon is the only way this information is conveyed, right? If it had like the word warning next to it, then this requirement wouldn't apply. But say it was a button or say it was an icon all on its own. There are really two important parts of this, the exclamation mark and the red triangle. And both of those need to have at least 3:1 contrast with the colors they touch. So and I'm not going to test this one. I've tested this before, and I can tell you that the white exclamation mark has at least 3:1 contrast with the red triangle. But because this isn't a white background, it's kind of a light gray background, like the example I showed before. The red triangle actually doesn't quite have 3:1 contrast with the gray background. So how can I address this? Well, one thing you could do maybe is add a border for icons that you're using. If you know that you are going to be using something on different backgrounds, social media icons are a common example, where maybe the icons are used in a bunch of different places. One way to help ensure that they'll have enough contrast wherever they're used is to have a border around those things. So now I have a white border around this red triangle. If I know that white and red, I know those two colors have at least 3:1 contrast, I'm good to go. Now the white doesn't need to have 3:1 contrast with the light gray background because because you can see the red against the white, so it already stands out. Even if the white bleeds into the light gray, the red triangle there is clear. So hopefully that distinction makes sense, that idea of adjacent colors where the colors matter, right? That is a little bit more about that requirement related to images. In addition to images, it also talks about 3:1 contrast of user interface components. It talks about a couple parts of these components. One term it uses is boundaries. Sorry, to quick drink. So what do I mean by boundaries? I've got a gray box here. That's a checkbox. It's a custom-made checkbox, right? It's not the browser native checkbox. I built a custom gray one. Well, I need to make sure that custom gray checkbox has at least 3:1 contrast with the background, so that I know, well, what's the part of this page of this element that I need to interact with? Where do I check? I need to be able to see that border. So that the term used in WCAG is boundaries. Another requirement that I want to briefly touch on just so I can build on it with 2.1 is related to keyboard focus. So in version 2.0 of WCAG, it says that keyboard focus, and that is that some kind of visible indication that something has, that you've navigated to something with the keyboard, right? I hit the tab key and this thing has focus, meaning I can now interact with it. WCAG version 2.0 says that thing needs to be visible. And sometimes there are problems where normally there's a focus outline where it's hidden using CSS. Maybe an outline is removed, and so you don't know there's any focus at all. And that's a WCAG 2.0 requirement. Excuse me. In 2.0, there's no requirement beyond that. So you could have a very, very subtle, say you got like 1 pixel, tiny little super light gray, 1.1 to 1 contrast, almost invisible to everyone type of a keyboard focus indicator. That would be allowed in version 2.0 of WCAG. Version 2.1 though does build on this, and it says that you need to have those indicators. They need at least 3 to 1 contrast with their background. So I've got a screenshot here. This is an older, what browsers used to do. This is the Chrome browser taken a while ago, where if I navigate to this element with the keyboard, it used to be that the focus outline by default was this bright blue. That worked just fine with the color white, but if it were any other color as your background, that bright blue wouldn't have enough contrast. So screenshot here, you can see the blue outline on a very blue background that's very similar in color, makes it difficult to see this. This would meet WCAG 2.0 requirement, but this would fail version 2.1. Now browsers have improved here. Chrome and Edge both have a combination of light and dark colors for their keyboard focus outline, so you can see it on any color background. It'll always have over 3 to 1 contrast. Firefox uses the link text color. Kind of the assumption is, well, that the text needs to have at least 4.5 to 1 contrast. If I use that same color for my outline, then it should have 4.5 to 1 contrast. This is still something you want to test. You just want to test those outlines using your keyboard, and using maybe an eyedropper tool or something like that to detect the color. So that's that enhanced requirement. I'll just briefly mention that there is, we did mention last time that there is a version 2.2 of WCAG that's being worked on that will probably be published early next year. And in this version, it does have more requirements for this outline so that it's more visible. WCAG 2.1, if I had 1 pixel, just 1 single pixel, that showed something at keyboard focus, if that pixel had at least 3 to 1 contrast, that would meet the WCAG 2.1 requirement. Still not going to be very useful. So 2.2 has said, it's got to be a certain size in order to actually be visible to the person and be useful. But focusing on 2.1, the requirement is that it have at least that 3 to 1 contrast. There's also the requirement that you consider the contrast of things with their different states. Now, this isn't necessarily a 2.1 thing. This is just a general, anything that can change colors in different states, hover over it with a mouse, navigate to it with a keyboard. Those kind of, checked something, you've checked a checkbox. Any state changes like that, you need to consider the contrast of all of those different states. So, you hover over a link, it changes color. Well, does that link, when it's hovered over, does it have enough contrast? You hover over a button, you check a box, you navigate to something with a keyboard. All those states need to have at least 3 to 1 contrast, or in the case of text, 4.5 to 1 contrast with their background. And so normally though, that requirement, it's just with the background, right? Typically, it's not that every single state of something needs to have at least 3 to 1 contrast with every other state. If I said I had a checkbox and it was one color when it was in its default state, and another color when I hovered, and another color when I check on it, and a different color when I navigate with the keyboard, having 3 to 1 contrast with all of those colors becomes almost impossible. So that's not what it says. It really just says with the background. But there is one important exception to that, one important thing to note, and that is what about your keyboard focus state? So this is where it's going to get a little technical. This one's a little tricky to explain. I mentioned before that WCAG says you need at least 3 to 1 contrast when something has, I'm sorry, let me say that a little bit differently. You need at least 3-to-1 contrast of your keyboard focus indicators. Usually that's an outline. Typically that's the best thing, right? You hit the tab key, something gets an outline, nice and visible. It doesn't say it has to be an outline. If you have a color change, say something changes from gray to blue when you navigate to it with the keyboard, that is allowed as long as that keyboard one, that this is specifically for keyboard focus, as long as that has at least 3-to-1 contrast with the default state. And that's only for keyboard focus. So here's a screenshot of a failure. If I hover over, say this is an example of a bar where the default color for something is a gray, like this word notifications. If you hover over something, it changes to a blue, like the word actions. That, as long as that text has at least 4.5-to-1 contrast in all of those states, that's just fine. It's not a WCAG failure. You don't need to look at the color difference or contrast difference between those two words, just, as long as they both have enough contrast on their own. However, if I hit the tab key and I come to this, say tab from the word notifications, hit tab and move to the word actions, and there is no keyboard focus outline, there's just a color change. That color change would need at least 3-to-1 contrast difference with the default. So this would be a failure. The screenshot here, the word actions changes to a bright blue, but that blue does not have 3-to-1 contrast difference with the default gray. That would be a failure of this requirement. So pretty technical. If we have time, we're going to dive a little bit more into this tool. This is kind of I'm going to briefly mention it now, and hopefully we'll have a little more time to demonstrate this later. But there is an article on the WebAIM site that talks about how you can use Chrome developer tools or dev tools to help test contrast. So I'm going to throw that link into chat. And sorry, I'm going to throw that link into chat. And we'll maybe, if there's time, I will go back to this tool and kind of demonstrate and talk a little bit about that. But if not, this article does outline how you can use that tool to help do some of this testing, to lock in your states, to say, I want to see what the keyboard focus is of this, or the mouse hover state, that kind of thing, so that you can do some contrast testing. There was a question from chat. Do disabled buttons or links need to meet the same contrast requirements? So they do not. That is a WCAG. If that's mentioned in version 2.0 of WCAG, it does say that disabled or inactive states of elements do not have a contrast requirement. So if you have a button that's disabled and it has less than 4.5-to-1 contrast, or its border has less than 3-to-1 contrast, that would not be a WCAG failure in that disabled state. So that is an exemption. And we do talk about that in a little bit more detail in that recording from the first session as well. But yeah, good question. That would not be a failure. And as long as we're kind of, I think, toward the end, let me double check my notes here. I think we're toward the end of the contrast parts. Are there questions? And I know that's a lot. I think I said this at the first session we did. I think contrast is actually one of the hardest things to understand and to test in most sites. So I know that was a lot of pretty technical, nitty-gritty kind of information. Are there any questions about those requirements? Okay, I will try to keep an eye out in chat. We're going to talk about some other requirements. This is also a little refresher, a little repeat related to one WCAG 2.1 requirement we talked about before, and that is text spacing. So this is a user, that the user can change text spacing, not your default spacing, but what a user can do to increase spacing of text. It says that no loss of content or functionality occurs when the user increases spacing between paragraphs up to 2 times the font size, lines 1.5 times, words 16%, and letters 12% of the font size. Gave an example of that, a little screenshot last time of a Wikipedia article where that had been applied. This is a link to a resource that I will put in chat. Again, also in that resource page of, sorry, let me put that in chat, of a tool that you can use to help test this. It's called the Text Spacing Bookmarklet. It gives you instructions on how you can use this. what you can usually do is, and I do already have, oh, come on. I already have this installed on my computer, but I find this place that says text spacing. I drag, or I can use a right click, but I can click and drag this to a place in my bookmarks bar. And then when I come to a web page, like this NASA press release, I can apply this text spacing bookmarklet to see if anything changes or breaks. Now I did that kind of quickly, but if I refresh the page, because I have this installed, I click text spacing, all of those are applied. Double the 2-time paragraph spacing, 1.5 line spacing, all of those, word and character spacing, all of them are applied at the maximum level to see if anything breaks. In this case, a couple things do break. One, this bar, the main menu bar, if I scroll into the page, it becomes invisible, the white text on the white background. Also a little trickier, but there's a sidebar of related press releases. If right now I only see the titles, but if I undo or turn off that text spacing, there's actually a little bit of text that tells me how recently that article or press release was published that becomes hidden when I apply text spacing. So that is an example, and maybe not hidden in all cases in this latest tab. On the related tab, it's hidden in, I think, in all of the tabs. So that would be an example of a failure of this requirement. Again, we talked about that a little bit more the last time as well, but I did want to mention, well, so if this fails, what caused it? It's probably more often than not this, and that is in your CSS, you have an explicit height for the containers, things that the boxes that contain your content. So if I, for example, have some text in a container that is 100 pixels in height, and I change the size or spacing of that text, it's going to bleed out of that box. It might cover content in the screen, as is the case of that bar at the top, or it might become hidden, as is the example of the sidebar, depending on what your overflow is for that content. But that's usually the cause. Often, a way that you can address this is to use CSS min height, so the minimum height of content. If you, min height kind of says, I'm not going to get any smaller than 100 pixels, but I can get bigger if the content requires it. So that's a way to address this issue if you encounter it in the things that you are testing or the things you are building. Hey, so that was just one other thing I wanted to mention with that text spacing. Again, we talked about other parts before. I will try to keep an eye out in chat for other questions. There was one to automatic testing tools like Wave accurately flag contrast issues. All tools that I'm aware of will have some limitations. Some tools like Wave, I think Axe does a lot of this as well in similar ways, will do things like test text contrast, and it will even consider size, because there are some differences in contrast for larger text. But it probably won't be able to do things like look at background images or icons. The examples that we talked about today that I talked about, it wouldn't check any of those. So there's going to be always a part that can be done with automated tools, and I think use the tools, when you can. And then there's going to be parts that are manual as well. So yeah, thank you for that question. Okay, let's talk about another requirement in WCAG related to mouse hover interactions. So consider somebody who's zoomed their screen. Maybe they have low vision. It helps to make everything on the page larger. Often, depending on the tool and the way it's done, but often that's done kind of like a loop or magnifying glass on the page where you kind of sometimes you center it using your mouse pointer and the whole screen, part of that screen zooms. So consider that scenario or something like that. A user zoomed a part of the screen, and this is a video, I'll play a couple times. They hover over this question mark icon to get some additional information. And as they hover over that icon, a box pops up, but when they move their cursor to try to read what's in that box, the box disappears. Made it very difficult for them to access this content. So WCAG 2.1 has some requirements related to this. Now, this is for content on hover or focus. So you hit the tab key to come to it, or you hover over it with the mouse. This is not for things you click on or things you activate with enter or spacebar. This is for things that you hover over or tab to navigate to with the tab key. For that content, it has some requirements for things that appear on hover and focus. There are three things, and all three must be met. Content must be dismissible without moving the pointer or hover or keyboard focus off that thing. Escape key can often dismiss. So an example of where that might be useful, say you've got a menu, like a menu that pops up when you hover over a part of, say like a rollover or menu at the top of the page, but you want to access the content under that menu. How do you get to it? You know, if you want to try to get to the stuff under, escape should dismiss that so that you can keep your pointer where it is and have the escape key dismiss that. Hoverable is the next requirement, saying when you hover over any part of that, the thing that opened the new content or the new content itself, that you don't lose, that thing doesn't close when you hover to the new content. So you need to be able to move from, you know, usually it's like a button or icon to say a tooltip. You need to be able to move from the icon to the tooltip with your mouse and have that thing stay open. And that's the example I just showed. The third is that it's persistent, meaning it stays open until you move away from it, either move your hover off that, or the escape key to dismiss it and close it, either of those things, but it needs to be persistent until you do one of those things. So those are three requirements. Tooltips are a common place where this can occur. So, you know, just that's what you need to look at and test and plan for. One way to sometimes address this is to, instead of requiring hover or focus, instead use a mouse click or enter in spacebar to toggle something instead of having it be like a tooltip. Any questions about that requirement in 2.1? Okay. All right, next is one, and I'm going to admit right at the top, I'm going to admit that this is, in my opinion, a little, I think this is a good requirement, but it was kind of pushed through at the last minute and is maybe not as useful as some of these other WCAG 2.1 requirements, but I do want to mention it. And it's called identify input purpose. And it says that the purpose of each input field collecting information about the user can be programmatically determined. So this is for stuff about you, the user, while you are filling in, say, a form. So if it asks for your email address, if it asks for your name, your address, you know, those kinds of things. If it asks for other information, for example, say a billing address that maybe isn't yours, or like an office, you know, something that's about someone else. You're doing, say you're filling in a, you click a share icon, and it says, you know, I want to share this thing with some other users, put their email address here or email addresses because I want to share this with someone else. Well, that's not your email address you put in there. That's going to be someone else's. So this is just for your information. It says that the purpose of those fields for user information can be programmatically determined. So how do you do this? Well, you do this with the autocomplete attribute in HTML. If you're familiar with autocomplete in an input, you can provide, and it's just autocomplete equals something. And there are a bunch of predetermined, kind of pre-identified values that you can use to identify the purpose of something. You know, what is your username? What is your full name? What is your given name? So often your first name. And there are specific names for these. So for example, if you had a field for first name, the autocomplete for that would be given name. That's the value. You wouldn't say first name. You have to use these specific identifiers. But this is supposed to help people maybe more easily fill in information related to themselves. If somebody struggles, maybe a cognitive disability. I don't know about you, but I sure use password managers and form fillers a lot. And this kind of information makes those smarter. So that's the idea with this. It is a WCAG 2.1 requirement. Any questions about that? All right. Again, these are kind of some odds and ends. It's sort of the purpose of this is to talk about some of these odds and ends in 2.1. Another is related to character key shortcuts. I don't know how I accidentally, as I was playing with this slide, I must have uncentered some of this text, but it's here's a screenshot, and this is from Gmail. In Gmail, you can identify single key shortcuts for things like starring messages, sending a message. Well, at send, I think is actually 2 key. Archiving or deleting or different things like that that you can do with 1 key. Well, that can be useful if you, if you're not relying on that keystroke for something else, but it can be intrusive for somebody who's using the keyboard to interact in other ways. Screen reader users, for example, might use single key shortcuts. For example, in a Windows screen reader like JAWS, if I hit the H key, typically, that's going to take me to the next heading in the page. I don't want it to open a help dialog, right? I want it to take me to the next heading in the page. Another place where this can be sometimes intrusive for some users is for people who use text to speech, where, with my voice, I might say, I might fill in a form. Sometimes those tools will actually send words as single letters, like, boop, 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 just like letter after letter after letter, instead of sending complete words. And those single letters can trigger these single key shortcuts as well. So what needs to happen here at the very least is you give somebody the ability to disable those. This is, again, probably more if you're building an application. There is the option to remap as well to change what those shortcuts are. But disable is probably the more common way to do this. In Gmail, it's just a radio button to turn on or off those keyboard shortcuts, as an example. So that standard autocomplete value, that is that link up above, those are those values, Bethany. And it does also, and I should mention, let me go back to this. It does also link to the actual HTML specification on those autocompletes as well. So that first link there does have those values as well. And let me throw a link in for that as well. And I know I have it right here. Enabling client-side automatic filling. So I'll put an example here as well. So it's just right above, thank you for the question, it's just right above your question in chat. All right, any questions about this, about single key shortcuts? All right, let's talk about status messages. So a status message, I think there's a realization with WCAG 2.1. Again, this was published in 2018. WCAG 2.0 is a lot older, right? 2008. And as the web has matured, it's become more dynamic, meaning more things happen without loading a new web page. One thing that's become quite common is to have dynamic messages. So things like, sometimes you hear the term toast for a type of message that pops up, and then after a while, pops back down or disappears from the page. So if you can't see the screen, how do you have those things presented to you? And as you do this, you also need to balance how intrusive are you going to be. So with a screen reader, you kind of have to focus on a certain place on one spot in the screen and have that thing be presented to you typically. So if you have, say, this toast message and you set focus to that thing, and so that a screen reader reads it when it appears, well, you just pulled where they were, right? You pulled their focus away from what they were reading and you put it in this place. Well, and what happens when that thing goes away? What do? Where does focus go? Does it go back to the top of the screen? Well, now they're lost. They were in the middle of something else when you decided to take their focus. So there are ways to help improve this and make it more accessible. The main way to do this is using ARIA, and we talked a little bit about ARIA last time. ARIA is a way to enhance HTML beyond what it's normally capable of doing. If you see ARIA dash or roll, either of those in a web page, that's ARIA. So in using ARIA, you can use what's called ARIA Live and tell a screen reader, this is something that is living. This isn't a static web page. This thing's going to change while you're in this page. What do you want to do about it? ARIA Live, for example, you can set something to assertive, and you can say, all right, as soon as this thing appears, and as soon as I make this thing, give this ARIA Live of assertive, I want you to read it right now. I don't want you to, don't finish the word you're on, don't finish anything, just read it right away. For some things, that's probably appropriate. For example, something pretty significant like your connection's timed out. You know, say I'm typing in a Google Doc and I'm just going along and it's like your connection's broken. Nothing you type is going to be saved right now. You sure you want to keep typing stuff? You know, you kind of want to know that right away. You don't want to just keep typing and find out later on. Something like that. If you give that ARIA Live of assertive or role of alert, that's telling a screen reader, read this thing now. If you give something ARIA Live of polite, that tells a screen reader, read it at a pause. For example, a chat. You're typing in chat. You want to know when new messages are posted to chat, but probably not mid-word while you're typing. It's like, just let me finish my thought. So I'm typing and kind of when I come to a natural pause, or I've finished reading the line I'm on, then it will let me know about this thing. So that's a more polite kind of a way to do this. There is also an off. For example, if you go back to that press release I showed earlier, NASA, say things are being updated every minute. You know, this was published 5 minutes ago. This was published, 6 minutes ago, 7 minutes ago. And this page refreshed those last published things every minute. You wouldn't want those changes to be read every minute. You would only want that to be read when you come to it. So there is also an off option as well there. So that's ways that you can control these status messages. Now, if you have something that you've given, say a role of, I should mention, ARIA Live and role of alert basically do the same thing. And when you give something that ARIA Live assertive or role of alert or ARIA Live of polite, you don't want to also set focus to that thing. Then it's going to be read twice and potentially going to disappear, like I talked about a second ago. So don't set focus to things that are like that. Use ARIA to have them read at the appropriate time without that person losing where they are in the page. If you are building things that are more complex, for example, I use Box a lot for work. And sometimes I'll have like multiple Box messages pop up. You know, this thing was updated. You want to refresh it. Your connection's timed out, whatever. You might have like 3 or 4 pop up at the same time. Sometimes it can be hard to control a lot of messages like that, or chat is another example. So there are techniques, and I'm just going to mention this. This is something we could talk about if there's questions at the end. But there are techniques to help you have maybe handle that type of heavy duty, lots of new live things being read. And it's usually best in that case to have one element, one place in the page that controls all of that, instead of having multiple places in the page that are all changing and being read. So just kind of an idea to keep in mind if you are building those things. So that's that WCAG requirement for status messages to make sure that those things that appear are going to be presented before they disappear. Are there questions on that? Somebody mentioned some trouble with Teams. Teams is an interesting example where, as Jay said, sometimes you might have messages set to read automatically to a screen reader, or the user might say, you know what, I need you to change that. And they actually go into their user preferences and say, I don't want you to read every new message to me. That's just an example based on a comment in chat of a place where that status message maybe needs to be changed by the user to be most efficient for that user. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about mobile. What are some things that are required in WCAG 2.1 related to mobile? One requirement is to not lock orientation of a page, meaning the user can have that viewed in portrait or landscape, right? On a mobile device, you can have that viewed one way or the other, and the page will respond, will allow you to change from one to the other. We talked about responsive design a little bit last time as we talked about zooming the page. We talked about that, that zooming up to 400%, where your page might look like a phone view on your desktop. Well, you know, that might look different if you turn the device sideways, or if you make that vertical, and you need to allow the page to respond in that way. Don't lock that. So that's that first requirement of don't lock orientation. Okay, and then there are a bunch of guidelines related to input modality, or I'm sorry, a bunch of requirements in a completely new guideline. So everything else in WCAG is added to an existing guideline. with that structure of principles, guidelines, success criteria, with one exception, and that is a guideline that's number 2.5 called input modalities. So principle 2 is operable. So I know this has to do with how a user might interact with a page or navigate within a page. So these are all going to be requirements related to that. This term input modalities, it's a good example of how these guidelines often create terms that aren't normally used. But the idea here is the way I interact with a device, kind of with a focus on mobile devices, that it considers that users might interact with the page in different ways. So the first requirement here is that you don't rely on multi-point or path-based gestures. It's single A. An example of this might be swipe to navigate. So you might have a page where if you swipe, it will allow you to move, say, from one tile to another or one item to another. If I'm looking, for example, on Amazon and there's some related products, if I swipe with my finger on my phone, it will allow me to move through these, to swipe to the next group of products. There's nothing wrong with that. What it says is you can't have that be the only way that you interact with content. If, for example, I have like a previous and next arrow in addition to the swiping, and those previous and next options are accessible, well, that's just fine because you're not relying on that type of swiping. Just as a little aside, WCAG 2.2 is adding something for drag and drop. You know, you tap on something and then hold it down and move it somewhere else to help make sure that that's it's basically saying you can't rely on drag and drop either. You can use it, you just can't have it be the only way to do things. So no swipes or back and forth, or you see these different types of gestures. Just don't rely on those. The second requirement is that pointer functionality can be canceled. I talked about this one a little bit. By default, I'm going to open any old page. So I'm on this HTML standard, whatever. Doesn't matter the page. I'm just going to come to a link, and I am going to click on this link. And I guarantee we've all done this, even if we didn't realize we were doing it. I'm going to hover over this forms link, and I'm going to click, and then I'm going to say to myself, you know what? I actually don't want to go there. So I'm going to move my mouse off that element, and I'm going to lift and then I'm going to unclick, right? I'm going to lift my finger up, and nothing happened. That's because by default, it's not the clicking down, it's the letting up of that clicker that makes that action happen. Same with like on a mobile device, it's not the tap down, it's the lift up that should cause a button or a link or whatever to do its thing. And that is what this requirement talks about. One reason for this is maybe people who have tremors. One of my parents and one of my in-laws have pretty significant tremors in their hands, and will often it's easier on a touch screen to just sort of push down and kind of move to the place you want to be and then lift up as an easier way to interact, because it's really difficult to be really precise with that tremor as if first trying to touch that thing. So it's that up movement that is what's going to trigger that, and that's built in. It's just if you're using JavaScript to custom build an interaction, you want to make sure you're not doing it on that down event. So if you do scripting, that should hopefully make sense. It's not going to be that down event, it's that up that's going to cause that thing to happen. Label and name is one that we already covered. We spent quite a bit of time toward the end of our last time together talking about label and name. Just again, a really super quick recap is that the thing you see is the label, the thing that's read to a screen reader is the name, and this requirement says that the label, what you see, needs to be contained in what's read to a screen reader. So if you see the word next, you can't have continue be what's presented to a screen reader. It can be next page, it can be next, but it can't be continue. So we talked about that a lot. So again, there's a recording of that's available as well. Then there is another single A requirement saying that you can't rely on device motion. It's you can kind of see the common theme that these have. In the same way that you can't rely, say, on swiping, you can't rely, say, on shake or on turning something over or tilting a screen. You can have those be options, like shake to erase is built into some programs. That's fine as long as you can also erase content in some other way. Turn it over to mute, fine, as long as there's also a mute button to do that as well. Just don't rely on that device motion. I do want to mention a couple triple A. I'm try that again. Triple A requirements as well. Now, I did mention, or Jared, one of us mentioned last time, AAA success criteria. That is not, these are not requirements that you will always strive to meet. Sometimes the content may not support these AAA requirements, but they're useful and should be considered. So, so there are two AAA requirements. One is that things that you build have at least a 44 by 44 pixel clickable target, the amount of space that thing takes up on the screen. That's because we got fat fingers, right? Trying to use devices. And for some of us, our motion may even be a little bit less precise. So having that large clickable target makes that more accessible. And that does align very closely with Android and iOS best practice. I think for one, it's 44, and for the other, it's 42 pixels. So it's a good thing to keep in mind, even if it's AAA. And then finally, the final AAA requirement says that you don't restrict input type. For example, touch only is the only way to do something. You kind of see a common theme here, right, for these different interactions. Okay. So that was just kind of a, again, the goal here is we talk about some of these new things in about an hour, and then hopefully take some time and go back and talk about some of this in more detail. So I do want to open things up to questions. I think one thing, if we do have time, that we can definitely do is look at some of the things built into the developer tools to help with testing of contrast and a couple other things, maybe even accessible name, as we talked about last time. But is there anything else? Are there any other questions that people have?
Yeah. While we're waiting for people to ask questions, I'd like to ask a question to start off, and then we'll go to somebody else. So you mentioned 1.3.5 identify input purpose. You were talking about that regarding form. So so 1.3.5, does that mean that, let's say we buy a form application that makes form for us, and what we do is we drag and drop, or we type in the name and it does that? Or should we rightfully expect the company to use the same tool name that WCAG, the WCAG has provided for them? Or do we have to go in and actually check on those? I mean, how do we move forward? We move to 2.1. A lot of people have templates. They have way they've been doing forms all along. Are we now asking them to say, okay, you have to go back and find your old form templates going forward and update the language you use to identify the form label?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing I want to clarify is that that list that I showed, even though I was pointing to the WCAG, even though I was pointing to where that was referenced in the document, it is really pointing to the HTML specification. So this isn't something invented by WCAG. This is something that was created within HTML, and it has been around for a while. The autocomplete attribute is well supported and built into many, but not all of these tools that you're talking about. I'm going to go to, I don't know about you, but often if I have questions, let me just kind of pull this over. If I ever have questions about, sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once. If I ever have questions about anything in HTML, I'll admit usually the first place I go to is MDN, started by Mozilla. And this is maybe a good place that we'll talk about that autocomplete attribute. So that's what you're going to be looking for. Again, this is only for things that where they're asking for you to provide information about yourself. So, you know, in a contact form, if it's your email address, your name, those would be fields where the autocomplete attribute would be a requirement. So yes, that is a WCAG 2.1 requirement. I did admit, I think it's one that maybe is a little, if I were king of WCAG, I would have made it AAA. Not that it doesn't have any impact, but it's just, it's just, I don't know. I'm gonna try to keep my own personal. I've already shared too much probably about my personal feelings about this, but that is what it says. So, and it is. I don't want to say it's not important. It is useful to have correctly identified autocomplete attributes. I'm going to share a story that's an embarrassing story from my life. This was lots of years ago, but still pretty embarrassing. I used a form filler to buy a plane ticket, and it was an international ticket. It was for Canada. I hit fill, and I just didn't really pay attention to what I did. And then I submitted the ticket, and when I looked back, it had actually put my middle name and my first name. It put those in the wrong two, like it swapped those when I was using this form filler. And it was a big mess because it was an international ticket. It cost, I'd say it cost me money. It cost WebA money to fix, and it was a big mistake. And it was my mistake. But it was also the browser, it was also the creator of that form's mistake, because if they had correctly identified those autocomplete attributes, and if my tool was looking at them, which I think most filler tools do, it would have correctly identified those for sure. Instead of just relying on label text or things like that to try to guess, it would have for sure known, well, this is first name, this is middle name. Be sure to put those in the right place. So it does have some value. Anyway, but that is what's required. It does mean that is what you would look for, is just look for that in your forms. So, autocomplete, and then there's kind of a list of correct values for that autocomplete for those kinds of things within your form. I don't know if that fully answered your question, Jay. I did, okay. I did notice there's a hand up within participants. I'm not sure how Jay, if you're good. I mean, I'm fine if someone wants to ask. Okay, perfect.
Oh, Jay, you're muted.
Yep, Catherine holding up. So go ahead, Catherine, and ask your question.
Thank you. I have a question about the requirement for the clickable target being a minimum of 44 by 44. Would that apply also to things like interactive graphics, dashboards, or things like that?
That's a good question, and that's part of why it is AAA. Is there's a recognition in 2.1? There's just too many exceptions. Toolbars. If you made every option in a content editor, like a text editor, if you made every single option 44 by 44 pixels, it just wouldn't work. Even like links. Technically, what if you have a link in your page? That's not going to be 44 pixels tall. And so they started listing all these exceptions, and that's why it's AAA. And that's why it should maybe be treated as this is a really good principle, but there are very possibly going to be some exceptions to this principle in your page. There is work in 2.2 to make this better. One of the things that it talks about is, and I will admit, it's one of the more confusing parts of 2.2, but it talks about not just the target size, but what it calls the target offset, which is space between elements. It's like if I've got a small icon, but then I've got, say, like 30 pixels of space before I get to the next icon. Well, now my target's bigger, right? And it's kind of bigger for both of them because there's this empty space. So if I tap, if I get at least part of the target, but then part of my finger's on all this white space, it still is a bigger clickable target. And maybe you can use some of that shared space as a way to make those elements maybe a little smaller, but still reduce some of the errors by having good white space between them. The rules on that are kind of weird, but I think it's also another good principle. It's just the idea is, are you making it easier for people to tap on the thing they want to tap on? And target size can be one way to do that. White space between elements can be another way to do that. And I think often it's maybe even both of them working together. I know that was beyond the question you asked, Catherine, but I think it's another, it maybe builds on this principle, and that's slated to be a AA, I think. I'd have to double check, but I think that's supposed to be a AA requirement in 2.2.
But it speaks to best practice, and so it's good in terms of whenever you're planning something to say, okay, how can we get at least in the ballpark here?
And I think mobile best practice does, again, it aligns. They didn't make up that number. They did start with iOS and Android best practice with that as well. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. Any other questions? And again, if you do want to raise hand, I think that sounds great as well. Either one. And actually, I think, let me double check chat. I think another question did come through.
Thank you, Jonathan. Becky Bernal has a question. She says, she just wanted to confirm that if something is in a disabled state, it does not need to meet any color contrast, so that is readable. Also, is this the same for ghost?
Oh, I'm in the wrong requirement. Sorry, actually, yes. Let me just go to. Let me just go to this requirement just to kind of show the example here. I figure they do have an example. If not, I can point to one of our own articles. Oh, they don't have one right here. Let me go to an article from the WebAIM site. Sorry. So yeah, just to make that a little bit more clear. Sorry, I'm just trying to look for. Oh no, I guess we don't have. We only have a small example here. Okay, it's kind of hard to see, but that's the point, right? It's kind of hard to see. An example is the submit. There's a disabled submit button. So in this page, you can see this is just, if I were to look at the code, I think this is just a input type of whatever submit probably, but it's right now it's disabled. And that's the attribute that's used in HTML is disabled. The term used in WCAG is inactive, probably because disabled carries a different connotation in, in accessibility. But that's an example of something that would be below the 3:1 contrast that is, yes, is an exception of this requirement. It is an exemption. Ghost text. I'm not familiar with that term of ghost text. Yeah, I don't know if that, I'm not sure. That's probably, might be very possibly a common term in design. It's just not one I'm familiar with. Yeah, I see a hand up if you wanted to. I don't know if I can unmute, but Jay, I think Kelly or.
Yeah, I had a question. We have more and more forms that are being built online and are, e-forms, but we also do have a lot of forms that are either still static PDFs or they're dynamic PDFs. And I guess I'm curious for these, when we talk about things like, the autocomplete and these standards that are sort of related to form fields, are those same expectations there for a PDF as they would be for an e-form on a website?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that actually in the future we are planning to do a much less formal kind of a discussion, not so much a training, more of just a discussion with a few interested parties related to 2.1 and PDF. Some things that we've talked about, the issue is, does the format support this requirement? For example, autocomplete. You can't really, in the PDF format, at least that I'm aware of, identify autocomplete in the way that's supported like it is in a web page. So if the format doesn't support it, there's a term that's used in guidelines, WCAG guidelines, of technology supported, kind of meaning a technique must be supported by the technologies that people are using. So that one's a little bit of a kind of like, well, if PDF doesn't allow for placeholder, I'm sorry, autocomplete in the same way that a web page does, can you fault somebody for not doing that? So that's, I don't know if that was a really useful answer to that, but for that one specifically, and a couple others, it's like, well, PDF doesn't, or you can't build that into your form in the same way, so it wouldn't necessarily be a failure.
This is Jay. Thank you, Jonathan. We have a question from Angela Markel, but before we go to her question, I'd like to go back to Becky's question. Becky and Nicole both said that another way the ghost text is also tested in the input area. So sometimes you have a search box and you put search inside the box. So it'll be placeholder text. for example, like first name in there, yes. So there you go.
Perfect. So that's a good question with placeholder text. And what I'm even going to say, there's kind of some debate about. So first name, if you're using that as strictly as a label for this, in this example here, using the placeholder attribute, there would be a requirement of 4.5 to 1 at least. The tricky part is you don't want it to be too dark, or this text would be confused with the text that somebody puts in the field, right? So it can't be so dark. And so in that case, there would be a 4.5 to 1 requirement. So one question you sometimes get though is what about, I can't remember if we have this. I don't know that we have this anywhere on our site. Yeah, you don't. We don't, not one that I can think of, but let me just, I'm just going to goof around for a sec here. No. This isn't a great example, but let's just pretend. Often a more common one is like email address, and then the text will be like your name at example.com or something like that. In that case, then the question becomes, well, is this text required to understand this thing, or is it not? Does it meet WCAG's definition of decorative text or not? And there's just some debate there. There is no, I think the general consensus is that this does need to have at least 4.5 to 1 text, at least 4.5 to 1 contrast, but I would recommend not going beyond 4.5 to 1. Probably just shoot right 767676. That color is probably the color you want for that placeholder text. You want it as light as it can be and still meet that WCAG requirement. And then let me double check. Okay. Yeah, Tony, that's a great question about how much work would it take to, some of these apps that are developed in-house, how much work is involved in making them compliant. It's just so variable. The analogy sometimes uses how much does a car cost? Is it $1,000? Is it $100,000? It's just so variable. It's just difficult to answer. That is a service that WebAIM offers to help maybe provide some estimates on some of that work even ahead of time. But yeah, that's just not one that it's so hard to say how much some of this work would cost. Yeah, there was also a question of maybe to review a little bit, to go back and talk a bit about the contrast requirement example. And I'm going to actually I'm going to unhide a couple of slides from my deck to give another example of this, and maybe one that's a little bit easier to understand. I'm going to see. Let me go back to my.
Jonathan, while you're doing that, and thank you for answering that question. But while you're doing that, we'll go back to Tony's question. Tony, also keep in mind that should we adopt WCAG 2.1, that will be for all work going forward. It will be forward looking. We will not force you to go back and fix everything you've done in the past 15 years to read that 2.1. It's only going to be a forward looking requirement. Now, what would you have to do to change your processes and what you do to make that happen going forward? Ideally, we're going to give you some time to figure that out. And so that's one of the questions we're going to have in our survey is, how much time do you think you need? 3 months, 6 months, a year to figure out what change to make to be ready to go forward. So that's something to keep in mind. Now let's go back and answer Markel's question. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay, so let me share another example, maybe a better example of what I was talking about before in terms of what's required in WCAG. Now, this does deal with states of things. So I've got this gray checkbox that has 3:1 contrast in the default state. I've got the checkbox changes from gray to green in its hover state. And that green has 3:1 contrast at the background, but little to no contrast difference with the gray. I'm not going to pull out the eyedropper, but they basically have the same level of contrast. So would that be a failure though? No, that would fulfill the requirements, because visually, my visual indication that something is in a hover state is my cursor, right? I can't remember, different screen shared products work differently. I don't know if you actually see my mouse cursor in Teams or not, but if I hover into a checkbox, my pointer tells me you're in this checkbox. And so I still need the border to know, well, what part of this thing is the checkbox, right? I still need at least 3:1 contrast to know where I need to be, but I don't need a contrast change to tell me where I'm hovering, because that's what my mouse does. If I look down at the next example though, let's say I see that exact same color. It changes from gray to green when I hit tab with the keyboard, and the focus changes from that gray to green. Now that would be a failure. Again, I put in parentheses here, probably a failure. I think it is a failure. WCAG, technically speaking, that is going to be a failure, this requirement. There's some debate there, but I should probably remove the word probably there. Because now the only indication that I have when I'm navigating with the keyboard where I am is that focus indication. So if that were to change from gray to green, but the green and the green had at least 3:1 contrast at the background, but not 3:1 contrast with the default state, that would actually be a failure. It would fail that keyboard focus requirement, right? That 3:1 contrast of your focus outline. So that would be a failure. Usually the best way to address this with focus is to, instead of maybe worrying about all your different state colors, just bring back that outline and make sure your outline has at least 3:1 contrast. And that's the default presentation for most things. It is for checkboxes, links, for radio buttons, for most things. And outline helps make that more clear. So bring that back. For text fields, it's your cursors in there, right? So that blinking cursor, that will also tell you where you are in the page. But for other elements where it's just that color difference, maybe ask yourself, can I do more than that color difference? Can I bring back maybe that keyboard focus outline? Some designers don't like it. They think, oh, that's kind of icky, but it's only going to be visible if somebody's navigating with the keyboard. And so making that, a visible focus outline is going to be probably the best way to address that. So did that make that difference a little bit more clear? Let me go back to chat and make sure. I'm going to kind of reread going over that again. So the example that I gave before, that maybe this checkbox example is a little more clear than the icon example. Let's see. Okay, so that helps. All right, great. Thank you. I kind of have been going back and forth between those couple of examples, and now I kind of like this checkbox one again a little bit. So thank you. Were there any questions I missed, Jay, or if you noticed any? I'm going to double check.
This is Jay. I don't see any more questions right now. I'm gonna post in the chat a link to the digital accessibility coordinator. Hang on. So most agencies have coordinators both at the agency and at the meta partnering agency as well. And both of them are great resources for accessibility of any kind, from document to application. So to answer Tony's question, those are the first people you should contact when you have questions about accessibility, and they are part of a network of coordinators who are at all the agencies. We do have a question from Jenny. In terms of dashboards and data visualization, what is your biggest recommendation as you prepare for 2.1? So let's say we create dashboard and data visualization today, and if we want to go to 2.1, what do you think people who create those, especially if they use tools like Tableau or Power BI, and they have to think about, okay, I'm relying on these tools. How do I make sure that I'm ready for 2.1?
That's a good question. I will mention that we did talk about some examples of accessibility of charts and things like that in that first session that we shared. So I'm just going to go to a survey. Now this is not a dashboard. I understand this is a simplified example. I'm going to make this just a little bit smaller. Even smaller, actually. Very simplified. This is not a dashboard. It does have certain like it does have some mouse interaction. It does have, you know, this was dynamically, or this was built just using kind of. This was built using a chart building tool instead of just, you know, being built by hand. But some of the same principles apply. One is that sometimes things like appropriate use of additional colors like black and white lines between elements is one way to help offset some things. One important consideration is can you present data that will reinforce this? Some dashboards maybe have a data view, a view where you can see the chart or table that's used to generate this. That's one consideration as well. You know, tools that do strive for good contrast. Another consideration here, I think, is, well, actually, let me think. I want to just clarify or repeat maybe something we talked about before. I'm not saying don't strive for good contrast in your visualizations. I'm not saying that. But the presence of this table that shows the same data as this chart does mean that this chart does not have a contrast or color requirements. It doesn't have that 3-to-1 contrast against all, you know, against adjacent colors because the table shows the same information. Again, not saying don't try to get good contrast, but this table I think is a good, or I'm sorry, this pie chart is a good example of the fact that when you start dealing with multiple colors, sometimes it does become difficult to have tools that give you enough high contrast colors to meet WCAG requirements. For example, this orange that's used in this region chart does not have enough contrast with its background. However, it is a reinforcement of what's already presented in this table as well. So that's one consideration is there a way to easily view the data that might be a more accessible view of the same information for somebody who has difficulty with contrast or color. Yeah, that's at least one thought there. I'm just trying to go through some of the other. Another is that a lot of these tools use a lot of icons, really heavy iconography in most data visualization tools. So you want to be mindful of the accessibility of those, both, you know, the color that's used, keyboard accessibility. Another thing that you do commonly see is things that appear on mouse hover. So, you know, if you have things that appear on mouse hover, are those presented in a way that meets the requirements we talked about? Those kinds of things. But a lot of that does have to do with whether or not the visualization is the only way to interact with that content or whether there's also a text-based way to interact with it.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. And now we're almost at the end of the time frame. And Jenny said, thank you for answering that question. I'm going to be posting a link to our newsletter in the chat because our newsletter is a great way for people everywhere to keep track of what's going on with accessibility data in Minnesota. But we encourage that you are not already subscribed to our newsletter to subscribe to our newsletter. I'm also going to go back to our own slides and wrap up what we want here. So I'm going to do that now.
You need to stop share or you can take over, right?
That's okay. Team to take over. So again, everybody, I really want to thank Jonathan Whiting as well as Jerry from the last session for doing the presentation. And like John said, we do have a part of our contract of planning to have a meeting, a smaller meeting for people who are most focused on PDF, people who are working in design and people who are working with the PDF stuff. And we'll announce that within those work groups as well to make sure that that happens. And we'll put the resource for that. And both this presentation and the previous presentation are posted, will be posted on the extranet, and all the coordinators who work with non-executive branch ACTs will have access to that to share with everyone. Somebody asked, what about my ACT does not have a coordinator? It's not every single ACT has a coordinator, and we're working to change that. So if you are interested in being a coordinator for an ACT that does not have one, contact us because we want to keep growing the coordinator role. And if you do not have a coordinator, but if you have an alternate or another, let's say you're a Minute person, and Minute does not have a coordinator for the partner agency, but the agency does. Yes, contact that person, contact either or any coordinator who is associated with the agency, whether the agency or a Minute person. They're both available for everyone who works with that organization. So, then one more item, let's see. So you're going to get an email from us to answer a survey about this. Again, remember, we asked you to think about how does what you're learning about WCAG 2.1 impact your end user? How does it impact yourself? How does it impact your planning for the future? What would happen if we do all this? So please answer that survey. We had a great response from the last survey. We hope that you will have a great response today as well. And then I encourage you to subscribe to the newsletter, and I put a link in there. And you can also subscribe by text message if you want to check the mn.gov, which is the same as 66468. And you can test that to the word MNIT space 8115. And you can get alerts on your phone as well. So again, thank you all so much from the coordinators who help organize it and our Office of Accessibility, and to WebAIM for doing these great presentations. Not only will we have their recordings online, we also have the link that they provided to their website, linking all the resources they offer. WebAIM has a ton of resources, and you should make sure that you use them all as well. So again, John, do you have any last words? And thank you very much.
No, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. You all have a terrific day and have a great day. Enjoy the snow. Drive carefully if you're out there driving right now, and bye for today.